Okay, perfect. Let's jump right in here. It's had some Zoom issues here in the morning. See if we can figure that out, but we'll have a recording nonetheless. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Oh, give me 1 second here. Perfect. Let's try again. One of those mornings with lots of tech issues. So let me confirm something here, and we're ready to go. So we are talking today about dealing with the human challenges of data to find actionable insights. I really like this topic. You know, I over the past 5 years, I think I've written very little about everything that happens once an implementation takes place. And it's really, there's really a big gap for most companies. And almost nearly every client has struggled in some way, shape, or form with actually using data, which is a little bit counterintuitive. You know, every company's excited to get it, and they think that once they have those reports or tools or people, everything will be different. But as it turns out, there's lots of things that come up that can derail companies. So a little about me. So I'm the founder of Practical Analytics. I worked with about 65, maybe 70 companies now, and help them tackle all different kinds of data problems from how they use data, how they choose tools, how those reports get tied into the regular work, and much more. Today, I really want to talk about 3 things. And for those who've been webinars before, I typically have about 20, 30 minutes of content, have some Q&A as we go along. You can put in the chat. And then we'll be done by 9 a.m. Pacific time, and maybe even a little bit earlier. So you get a little bit back of your day. So here are the 3 things I wanna talk about today. And again, to understand the context of where this fits into a strategy or where you might fit as a company, we're beyond tools, we're beyond hiring the right people, we're beyond defining the right strategy. We have reports, we have dashboards. Now it's really about how do we actually use that data, right? What's going to be the day-to-day usage of those reports? How do you find insights? And it's really all about people. At this point, it's trying to equip people with the right tools or the right training, really, to say, so they're able to actually use this data. So we'll start by thinking about training. This is typically the very last step in any kind of strategy. And there's a bit of a honeymoon period, you know, where you just bought a new tool or a new or partner with a new vendor, and there's excitement, and training is the last thing they do. But we'll talk about how to think about training beyond just a one-time event and more of a life cycle. Then we'll look at some trust issues. There's a few things that I've written here before, funky data and other things, but just what are the things that prevent teams from trusting their data? And then lastly, we'll talk about the right people and the right roles, including this idea of a data marriage counselor, which is something that has come up in my client work. When I started writing about data, I would always say something similar. Say, you know, you do some research, you choose the right tools, you implement them, you curate the data, and then you train. You run through a training session of some kind, and you're ready to go, right? And this is also what bigger projects typically have, right? They have a training session at the end where they explain how to use whatever it is you just bought and hope that that's enough. In most cases, it's not, right? So when I think about training and when I run training with clients, this is typically what I'm looking at. So we'll start, on the bottom part of the curve here with some group training, just like everyone else does. And we'll take, yes, I think I did see some of those Zoom issues. Looks like I got messed up a little bit with the calendar invite. So hopefully people find the one in the email, which apparently works. Otherwise, I will record it for everyone who can't attend. Going back. So we start with group training. This is quite common. This is what everyone does. It's great because you can train 5, 20 people, 30 people at the same time, give them a crash course on what's going on. But then I want to add a few other things. So the next thing I want to add is ad hoc. And individually, everyone cares about different things, right? So we want to be able to give them specific training on what they care about. Give you an example. I had a client that was a SaaS app. There were about 70 people when I worked with them. And we went through a small project on marketing tools, Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, and Google Optimize. And we did this. We had the general group training where we had to split the session among everything we had just implemented. So every tool got a little bit of time. And that was somewhat helpful, but what was really helpful for them was the ad hoc sessions. I was able to sit down with their team, it was about 7 of them, and individually talk about what they care about. And understandably, the engineers wanted to understand, what were some of the technical details behind Google Tag Manager? How will this affect performance? If they wanted to deploy a tag, what would that look like from start to finish, specifically for an example they have upcoming. And then marketing people are really diving deeper into a report and trying to figure out how to segment that and slice that. So ad hoc training can allow you to do that. Then I want to think about what I call reactive training or reactive support. And it doesn't have to be complex. This is, this can be as simple as a Slack channel, for example, where anyone can post questions and get those questions answered. We may come back to group, and if we look at this life cycle, we might be looking at something over, let's say, a year. So we might come back to a group session 6 months in, maybe once a quarter. And then lastly, we also want to create some docs. So just some basic documentation here on best practices, what reports mean, things like that, right? And then the whole process might repeat over time. So a little bit of details on how to think about this. So group sessions, typically 60 minutes. There's a bit of mix there of theory, practice, Q&A. And ideally, it's structured by team. So you may have a session for a marketing team or a product team, or maybe a use case, retention or acquisition. One thing to understand here is that this group session is typically very shallow. There's only so much people can really grasp. I remember I used to run a lot of training sessions on tools like Mixpanel or Amplitude. And I know this tool inside out because I used it so much, and I'd done this specific training maybe 30, 40 times. So I go through it and I'd be explaining concepts. And to me, it's extremely straightforward. And as it is for, I think, a lot of engineers. But it was clear when I would talk to people later on in the ad hoc session that they only really got a couple of points. And maybe those couple of points came in the first 30 minutes of the session. And then the rest was just too much. It was just too much information, and they didn't capture those details. So groups are helpful as the initial point, but then we can follow on with ad hoc. Ad hoc are simple, 15, 30 minutes, one-on-one, and ideally they're focused on some kind of day-to-day question. So for a marketing team or a marketing manager, that may be something like a campaign, right? They have an upcoming campaign and they're trying to figure out how to track it. And this will be scheduled as needed. In most teams, I might run through maybe 2 or 3 ad hoc sessions over about 90 days from the group session. Reactive, as I mentioned, is Slack. I started this work actually about 4 years ago when a client of mine did this. Before I started recommending clients do this, and they set up a channel with about 10 people. So people representing marketing, product, operations. And this channel became very active. People would drop links into reports and ask questions about exactly what did something mean or why was the number off. There were technical questions being posted, technical issues being posted. And it was a great way for people to get support on how to use the tools they had set up. And I remember seeing that and I thought, wow, this is really quite effective as a way to tackle day-to-day questions and for people to feel like they can go to someone, right? Not just the vendor support, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad, but someone within the company. And we'll talk a little bit about ownership. If you were to set up a channel like that, who would own that? And then lastly will be documentation. So very common, engineering teams, for example, are documenting a lot. And here we just want to do the same thing. So we might be documenting core dashboards and what they mean, or maybe reports, or maybe basic functions, how to run retention reports, things like that. There's not a lot of best practices here. It really depends on the team by team basis, and every team likes to document things a little bit different. But what matters is you document it. So as people leave, or as there's turnover, there's something to work from. You also see this a lot now in tools. For example, Mixpanel and Amplitude, Google Analytics for a long time had annotations, for example. These are minor examples of documentation, right? Documenting what an event means, what's the event description, what's the logic. Amplitude has a way to build what they call I think they call a notebook, where you take a report and then you make notes on what that means. Another example of documentation. So it's just a way to add some explanation to what data means. So that's training, right? So you can go from seeing it less of as an event that happens once you finish implementation, and more as a series of a process that will repeat over and over again. The next thing we can talk about here is trust issues, right? And here we can actually start with a bit of a perspective shift. My background, as I mentioned, is as an engineer. So a lot of the technical details behind tools are straightforward to me. And when I work with a lot of engineers, they feel the same. If we think about the technical complexity of data, it isn't very high compared to coding or a few other things. Maybe machine learning might qualify into something that's technically complex, but nonetheless. So really, if you think about it for non-technical folks or people who don't have as much experience in data, data is really, it can be seen almost as a black box for a lot of people, right? And I've seen this over and over again when I work with marketing teams or product teams or executives who don't have a strong technical background. Everything they look at when it comes to data is really based on trust, right? They trust that this number makes sense, that this report was built correctly, that this is the proper trend line, and so on. Over time, you can train people or provide enough education for them to figure out sort of how numbers are being calculated, but it's not always the case. And some engineers just say, well, it's obvious, Google Analytics takes the data in a hit, it has different properties, some are dimensions, some are metrics, and this is how it calculates sessions and this and that, and it's all technically true. But most people don't think like that, right? And this is where I think a lot of issues come up, where it's all based on trust. It's all based on that as long as the data is correct, we can use it. So I came up with this idea called funky data a few months ago, and it represents a lot of what I see with clients. Clients would look at a report or a dashboard, and it was always the same reaction. It seemed like the numbers were correct, right? They seem to be within the ballpark, but there was something weird about it. There was something that just didn't add up, and it was minor, or maybe in some cases it was major. So it sort of reminded me that there was something funky about the numbers that we're looking at. And I've seen about 3 major scenarios for funky data, and there will likely be more as time goes on. But this is really any data that doesn't make sense internally, right? The first scenario that can sort of cause funky data is what almost everyone assumes to be the issue, just plain old technical mistakes. This may mean how the data was collected, how it's stored, how it's calculated. It doesn't matter. This is a technical error. In the best of cases, technical mistakes usually means the tool made a mistake in how the data was collected. In the worst of cases, especially at companies where there's very little trust and there's perhaps even resentment, usually the blame actually goes to the engineers themselves, right? The engineers themselves didn't set up this properly, which is why we don't have any accurate data. And now we have this weird, funky number that no one can trust, right? Technical mistakes, like any other bug, they need to be examined, they need to be double checked. In a lot of cases, you can take a secondary data source and double check those numbers against that. But likely the most straightforward scenario here to fix, and where most companies spend their time, right? The other 2 scenarios are a little bit trickier, right? In the second one, we have misaligned expectations. This is very common for teams who actually haven't had data for a long time, which you'd be surprised how many companies fall in this category. But in this scenario, effectively people have an expectation of what the numbers should be. And this may come from gut feeling, napkin math, maybe someone took some data and ran some analysis on Excel at some point, but they have an assumption, right? So they say, it is obvious that our conversion rate from sign up to paid is 10%. But they don't really have a lot of data to back it up. They just assume. So at some point they get data and someone built a report and maybe that conversion rate is 5%, right? So all of a sudden, everyone has been operating under this assumption of the 10% number, and now you have this number that's way off. So there's an initial reaction or against that number that needs to be addressed. And this is where we start to see a lot of those psychological human issues, right? Now you're not debating based on facts. It's almost based on an emotion, right? But nonetheless, for teams and whoever owns the data, this is a scenario where it's something that takes time, right? You can show that the numbers were triple checked. You can show the logic behind how the data was calculated, not because people want to know the technical details, but just to show that there was homework and that this was properly done. And this is a matter that it sometimes just takes time, right? I've seen teams that sort of stuck to this number and they begrudgingly accepted the new number, but over time, as they got more and more data and as they saw the data trend in a certain direction, then they were able to adjust their expectations. So it's really a combination of showing that the numbers are right and giving the time, right? Letting people adjust to the new reality. And then lastly, we have unexpected user flows. I'll give you an example. I had a client recently and they're a consumer mobile app, and they had a lot of customers before they actually launched their mobile apps. They had a crowdfunding campaign and they had a lot of backers who supported them. So the tracking came sort of halfway through all this. So when we started looking at the mobile app performance, we wanted to look at a simple flow. The most simple you can probably think of, how many people create an account, onboard it, and then pay for a subscription, a monthly subscription. And then, we were able to build that out in Amplitude, get the numbers, but there was always a large percentage, about 25% in their case, that seems to be missing from this flow, right? That is, in any given month, there might have been 300 new subscriptions, but our report was only looking at 200. And this is where we started running into those unexpected user flows, right? So the missing 100 subscriptions or 100 new customers, it's not that they weren't being tracked properly. It wasn't a technical mistake. Instead, it was actually just a different flow, right? A lot of those users had an account from before when the tracking was started, or in some cases, actually, they had been a subscriber before, so they weren't being counted as they reactivated their subscription. But this caused a lot of issues, right? Because same thing, you have a marketing team who's looking at the data, and there seems to be a large chunk of it missing. So how much can you really trust the overall number, right? Are you really gonna build this into a report and then run campaigns based on these assumptions? So unexpected user flows, like misaligned expectations, it becomes a matter of debugging the data, trying to figure out where all these little edge cases, and being able to explain them, right? So once you're able to explain them and the explanations are reasonable, you're able to then build trust back up in the data. What's interesting to me about all the trust issues with companies is that trust is, it's very hard to build, but it's very easy to lose, right? I've been in companies where we spend months and months properly setting up tools and ensuring that everything's right from a technical perspective and training, and the team is great. They trust the data, they're using it. And then something happens. Maybe there's a big bug, maybe just someone drops the ball, and the accuracy of the data drops, maybe just only for a few weeks. All of a sudden, that trust, which was built, is sort of lost, and teams are much more hesitant to really put their faith on the data, and you sort of have to work again to build it back up, right? I think it's a cycle that a lot of companies fall through, where they go through up and down periods of trust. Great. So we talk about training. We talk about ensuring that people have the skills to actually use whatever they were given, and we talk a little bit about trust issues, right? The what happens to companies when they look at data and they actually don't know how to solve them. Lastly, let's talk about people, right? And in this case, putting the right people into the right roles. Fundamentally, data is really driven by two main teams, right? You have the business teams. This would be marketing, product, maybe executive management teams could be considered here as well. And you have technical teams, the engineers who actually implement and set up tools. This could be front-end, back-end engineers, or maybe data engineers. And these teams really misunderstand each other quite a bit. And there's a tension between both of these teams. The tension isn't necessarily bad, but it's there. We have to acknowledge it. So really, the classic story is the marketing teams want a new email, a new provider, a new vendor, and they need the technical team's help to implement it, but the technical team has no time. Right? They're behind by 4 weeks on the product roadmap. They have a lot of bugs. They have all those projects that they want to do, not just fixing things, they be able to invest in certain areas. So they have no time to help the marketing team with the request. And this is where we come in and we start looking at things. So in any project, companies will bring me in and they say, hey, you help us lead this and organize people and get them into the right structure. And that can work. You can go through a great setup, a great initial implementation, as I've done in many projects. But then if you don't fix the underlying issues, specifically ownership, then the whole data will fall apart over time. And it doesn't take a long time. This is not it will fall apart in 5 years. I'm then saying it will fall apart in 3 months. So really what I want clients to do, and what they need to do, is think about ownership in two major roles. And it may be 2 people to start, it may be 1 person, or in bigger companies, it may be entire teams. So you have multiple people take slightly different pieces of the ownership. So we want someone to own the business side, that is to own the why of the data. So why do we need data? What data do we need? What questions do we need to answer? And what's the business value of this data? This is typically someone on the marketing side or on the product side who really cares about data and is gonna ensure that they have it. I had a client who they're a big payment processing company, and they don't really have a lot of data. The company has been around for about 20 years. And there was this one product manager who became my client who loved data, right? And she thought, this is great. This can be the advantage we need as a company. But she didn't have the ability to sell the entire company. Instead, she just had control over her team. So she actually started investing in different parts of data. We worked together. We set up a basic stack, and then basic reports in the dashboard. And that gave her insights into her product, which is just one of about 6, I believe. But then what was great about this is she was then able to evangelize to the rest of the company, right? So create a little presentation, education for how other product teams could do the same, or how other marketing teams could do the same. And then slowly other teams have started to adopt similar ideas. And even the company as a whole has started an entire initiative to switch how data will get used within the company, right? So that's typically the kind of person you can imagine here. Someone who sees the value of data on the business side and is able to work with different stakeholders, in most cases other business units. On the technical side, it's really all about how do we collect the data, right? What's the SDKs, the libraries, whatever it may be. This is completely technical, so it's usually going to be an engineer. At some bigger companies, you have data engineers, but the roles vary a little bit different. But the main thing to note here is it needs to be someone who has access or accountability within the product itself. A common issue that companies run into is they set up tracking, but then there's a new product release and the tracking breaks because naturally, the code changes. But the issue is not that the code breaks, it's that there was nobody there to QA it, to ensure that everything was accurate before it was released. So ideally, someone on the engineering side takes ownership and says, just like we don't want to release a product with bugs, we also don't want to release a product release that doesn't have tracking, or where the tracking broke in a significant way. So think about ownership like this is helpful. And even a lot of companies who bring me in and they've been struggling with data for a long time, this is usually one of the issues that they're missing. No one owns the data. No one owns anything really, right? And if you go back to some of those training examples, we talk about like Slack channels and things like that. For that Slack channel to work, there needs to be someone who has some kind of ownership of the data, right? Because when someone else posts a question, you can hope that the group responds, but initially it's helpful to have someone who's going to likely be answering the bulk of the questions. And again, you might have someone on the technical side who's answering how an event is tracked or what's the logic behind it. And you may have someone on the business side who's just answering basic question on, how do you do this in Mixpanel? How do you do this in Google Analytics? Or how do you create this report with SQL? So this is where those people come into place, right? Other companies will have them, and if you don't have the channel, this is just the person you reach out to when you're at the office. Then we have this special role here, which I've been cheekily calling the data marriage counselor. Honestly, this came up because I was finding myself in meetings between technical team engineers and marketing people, and it became very apparent to me that I was a mediator, right? I didn't know this beforehand. They never told me, but once I was in there, it was clear that was my role. Here was the engineering team with their concerns on how the marketing team had wasted the time over multiple times, and this was yet another thing they wanted to do. And here was the marketing team saying, well, we need this because we never done it right, and it's kind of your fault. And they would just look towards me and say, what do you think? So really what this role becomes is someone who can translate what the business units are saying to what the technical team cares about, right? So in most cases, the more my client works, it also means making things a little bit more approachable, right? So a marketing manager might tell me that the engineering team is completely holding them back, and they are unable to help them with their growth targets. But I'd be able to take that to the engineering team and say, you know what, the marketing team has some aggressive growth targets, and they would love to get your help in getting this implemented, right? So ensuring that there's a little bit less conflict. So what coming back to the top point here, right? Remembering that both teams are typically a little disconnected from each other, right? Engineering teams have very little resources for what they need to do, so they're trying to be careful in how those resources get used. And for the most part, they just want to use them in the most effective way that will help the company. Marketing teams, on the other hand, typically have more resources. They have more budget. They have access to more budget typically, and they're just trying to figure out what's the fastest way to grow or to hit their targets or whatever it may be. So this person, and I help some clients set up a similar role and hire for a similar role, is someone who can go in between them. So someone who is able to understand the business value of data and how to use data, but also has a technical background enough to be able to converse about technical terms or limitations. So I wrote here a few skills that I think this person can have, and I'll talk a little bit about who it can actually be. So of course, we start with business strategy. So just understanding the overall place where the business is going. We have technical skills. This person might be a coder, or they might have basic coding skills, but they're not necessarily a full-time coder, but they understand enough that they can talk about SDKs and APIs and even technical issues that may come up in the tracking without getting completely lost. I made an example earlier about how data gets captured by Google Analytics, with hits and dimensions and so on. This is the kind of technical skills I'm talking about. A systematic problem solving, right? We looked at trust issues and training. A lot of it is about building systems on how to train people and how to fix issues. This is what I would consider here. People skills, it's maybe one of the biggest skills here. Really, a lot of it is what you might call politics or just simply team building, right? But you're trying to make do with whatever resources you have. So it really means working with people to compromise on what they need so they can get something going. And then lastly, just some statistics skills. This is just a basic data skill to be able to understand the report that you're looking at, and maybe even you start getting at some of the basics of machine learning and things like that. In terms of who this person could be, some companies are hiring now for what I consider a little bit of unicorns, technical marketers, right? People who have a strong marketing background, but who also have a technical background of some kind. So that's one option. Again, I think it's a little harder to find that. And at almost all the companies I dealt with, I find marketers are getting more technical over time, but they're still not, they're still missing quite a few technical skills. What I've seen actually work much better for companies is actually taking an engineer in the company who's interested in marketing, right? So this might be a front-end engineer, or maybe a back-end engineer, maybe even data engineers to an extent could fit this role. But someone who's technical, so they'll sort of be able to pick up a lot of the skills, technical, systematic, and statistics will come very naturally to them. And in that sense, they just need to be taught the business side, the business strategy, and perhaps some of the people skills, how to deal with people. Yeah, so there may be some debates about which ones are easier or harder to learn, but I've seen that work quite well with clients. Perfect. So we're here at 8:45 Pacific time, so just here at time. So looking back at what we talked about, remembering that we're starting basically as soon as an implementation or report is done, and then we start thinking about training, right? Thinking less about this is a one-time event and all the different stages that we want to take people through to train them properly. We talked about trust issues, right? Funky data and some of the common scenarios that cause the lack of trust to be created. And remembering that for a lot of people, especially non-technical teams, most of the data is really built on trust, right? It's something that they need to trust before they can use. And then lastly, we talk about the right people. So, how to have the right ownership for data, whether it's on the business side or on the technical side. And then even about roles like this data marriage counselor that I've been hearing a lot from clients. So we'll take a couple questions if there's any, and if not, we'll shut down and then we'll end a little early. Let me check my Zoom here. Perfect. So no questions. I'll also send you what I call the 3-question survey. Send you by email. I'll send you the recording by email. And really, what I want to ask you here is any feedback on the webinar. I think there are a little bit of Zoom issues there, so that's definitely something to fix in the future. But any other feedback on the content, anything you want to see more of, more stories, whatever that may be. If you know any organizations that could benefit from this kind of content in the form of a speaking engagement or a workshop, I've taken some of the same ideas, which we cover right now in about 40 minutes, and expand on them, right? So be able to take teams, so a lot of exercises and group discussions to be able to work out a lot of these issues relevant to their work. And then lastly, if you know any company or if yourself want to work with me on these issues. So for now, let me go back here to Zoom. Stop sharing. Perfect. So thanks, everybody. Talk soon.